Hello everyone, this is Mr. Underkoffler. Today we're looking at the guide that's called the simple interest formula. I equals PRT. All right, let's talk about some vocabulary dealing with depositing money and borrowing money, mainly from the banks. To deposit money into a savings account means to put money into the account. When you keep your money in the bank, you will actually earn extra money called interest. I don't know if you've ever even known about that. Now, it's not a ton of extra money. We're going to talk about how that extra money is calculated here in a little bit. Now, when you borrow money from the bank, which is traditionally called a loan, you don't get to borrow it for free. You must pay it back, obviously, but also pay back extra money called interest. Are you noticing something here? Extra money for interest applies to savings accounts, extra money that you earn, but it also applies to when you borrow money, extra money that you have to pay back. Now, the interest you earn or pay in each of these situations is calculated by an interest rate. Now, that interest rate is a percentage. And in the formula, it's actually called the R because it's the interest rate, even though that's a percentage. Now, the interest is also calculated depending on how much you had to deposit or borrow, and the time in years is also a contributing factor here. The amount of money you deposit or borrow is called the principal. That's a vocabulary word you're going to need to understand because it is one of the variables here in our formula. I know that's the same spelling as like a head principal of a school or an assistant principal of school, but in this case, the principal is the amount of money that you initially deposit into your savings account or that you initially borrow for your loan. All right, here's a summary of what each of these variables represent. That extra money that we've been talking about that you earn in savings accounts or that you have to pay back on top of the money you borrowed to begin with, that extra money is called the interest. Principal is the money that you deposit into your savings account, or it's the money that you initially borrowed for the loan. The interest rate, which is the R, is a percent that you must put in decimal form, as we've been doing with all different types of percent equations that we've been talking about so far in this unit. And then finally, the time. It must be in years. If you get months, you're going to have to divide by 12 or just think to yourself what fraction or decimal of a year would these months be. And we will do some problems like that together coming up. All right, speaking of problems, we'll do together. Let's do number 1 and 2 and 3 together. Here we go. Problem number 1. Find the interest earned. If you deposit $12,345 into a savings account, that earns 3.75% interest, and it stays in the account for 4.5 years. All right, let's start by writing down the formula. Especially when a formula is new, you're going to want to start with all the letters in that formula. And then we will one by one replace each letter with what it is from the information given to us in the problem. So, what did this problem want us to find? This is the number one question I keep emphasizing this entire unit. What did it tell us to find? It said to find the interest earned. Now, do you remember what variable that is? The interest either earned or paid, depending on what kind of situation we're talking about, is capital I. So, if we're trying to find the interest earned, then capital I is your unknown variable. It'll stay I. Which means this $12,345, it's not the I. It must be the principal. In fact, if you noticed here, there's two variables that are money. The interest and the principal. They are both money. But you have to always pay attention to details as to what kind of money we're talking about. Is it the interest money or is it the money we deposited or borrowed? And as you can see here, we are depositing $12,345. So that is the principal. Just like you saw up here, principal is the money deposited, or for loan problems, it's the money that you borrow. Okay, now that we got that squared away, that's the P. What's the R? What's the T? The R is the interest rate, which is a percent that we must write in decimal form. Now, you might be like, well, it already has a decimal. No. That's not what I mean by decimal form. It means moving that decimal point 2 places to the left, which you should be used to doing because we've been doing that on all types of percent equations. So instead of 3.75, we move 2 places to the left, put a 0 here in this little spot, 0.0375 times T. T is the time in years. And good news, this one is already in years. 4.5, it'd be a little quicker to write that as 4.5. That way we don't have to use the mixed number key in our calculator. A lot quicker to punch in 4.5. So there's your substitution. All the numbers have been placed in, and capital I, we already said, was what we're trying to find. Well, good news. If the variable you're trying to solve for is already by itself on the left, then we're just going to multiply these numbers together. So type this in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Yes, I know this is kind of creative. Times 0.0375 times 4.5. And double check that you type that into your calculator correctly. Lots of things to type in here. That should give you more digits than what we need for dollars and cents. Remember, I is interest. That's money. So we need this to be dollars and cents. So we look at the third digit to the right of the decimal point. Since that's an 8, that's 5 or more. We're going to round up the 1. So it's $2,083.22. And since I rounded, I like to use the approximately equal to symbol. Okay, problem number 2. Find the interest paid if you borrow $8,000 over a period of 30 months at a 5.5 interest rate. 5.5% interest rate. Once again, start with the formula. I equals PRT. And then let's break it down. What is going to go in for what? And I want to say again, what does the problem ask you to find? Very important that you know this. It says find the interest paid. Now, interest paid instead of interest earned because this is a borrowing problem. That's why I said interest paid, not interest earned. But either way, interest is capital I. So there you go. Now, don't get interest mixed up with interest rate. Interest rate is the percentage we will put in for R in decimal form. But before I do that, let's talk about the principal. The principal, remember, is the money either that you deposit for savings accounts problems or it's the money that you borrowed. And that's exactly what we have here. We borrowed $8,000, so that is our principal. The interest rate is the percent that we have to move the decimal point 2 places to the left to put that in decimal form. So 1, 2, that's going to make this 0.055. And then times the time, but be careful. The time must be in years. Ladies and gentlemen, you might want to put a big star next to that. This is something that sometimes kids forget. If you're given the time in months, you have to convert it to years. That's just the way this formula works. So we know 30 months is definitely more than a year. There's 12 months in a year. So some of you are already thinking about this, aren't you? You're like, okay, so there's 12 months in 1 year. There's 24 months for 2 years. But this is more than that. How much more? Some of you already figured it out, that it's 6 months more, which is half of a year. And therefore, you're like, well, then this is 2.5 years. If you were not able to figure that out mentally, there is another way to get 2.5. You can take the months and simply divide by 12. Why 12? Because there's 12 months in a year. And that will then change this into the years. So feel free to write that down if you were not able to figure that out mentally, that 30 months was 2.5 years. Okay. Once again, just like problem number 1, we're solving for a variable that is already by itself. So go ahead and multiply these together, and you will get $1,100 of interest, which is kind of a bummer because you would maybe think that 2.5 years isn't that long, but even though you borrowed $8,000, you're paying $1,100 more in interest on top of the $8,000 that you borrowed. So this is the unfortunate thing about borrowing money from the bank. You have to pay it back plus interest. All right, problem number 3. This is the last one I want to do with you. This one's a little interesting. Let's read this. Amy paid $990 in interest for a loan after 3 years at a 20% annual interest rate. What was the amount of the loan? Show your work to the right. Okay, once again, I equals PRT. I know some of you don't want to write that down every single time, but I'm telling you, it helps you to keep track of what numbers are going to go where. I is the interest. Does this problem tell us to find the interest? It doesn't. It says what was the amount of the loan. That's not the interest. That's the principal. Now you're like, how'd you know it was the principal? Because the principal is the money you deposit or the money you borrow. And I told you at the top of the page, the money you borrow is often called a loan. And that's what number 3 wants you to find, the amount of the loan. But furthermore, I can prove to you that we're not trying to find interest because the very first sentence says that Amy paid $990 in interest. It's literally telling you right there that $990 is the interest. So, very different now for number 1 and number 2. Number 1 and number 2, we were solving for I. But here we know the I. We know the interest is $990. We are solving for the principal. All right, 20% interest rate. That is a huge interest rate, by the way. That's 0.20 or just 0.2. The time must be in years. Oh, our time here is already in years. So we don't have to divide by 12 like we did on number 2. This time is already in years. Okay. How do I solve for the variable when it's clearly not by itself? Well, we will eventually do the inverse of multiplication, which is division. But before we do that, why don't we go ahead and do the little bit of multiplication that is right here next to each other? Let's do that first. 0.2 times 3 is 0.6. That's multiplied to the p, obviously equal to 990. Now we can do the inverse of multiplication, which is division. We'll do it on both sides. I hope you're writing all of this down. 990 divided by 0.6, use your calculator for that. And that should give you $1,650. That was the amount of the loan. I know that seems crazy that the loan is not that far away from the extra interest you had to pay back. Well, that's going to happen when your interest rate is really high here, 20%. That's a much higher interest rate than what we were looking at on problem number 1 and problem number 2. Okay, so in summary, always know what you're asked to find. Not every problem today is going to be like number 1 and number 2, where they ask you to find the interest, and then capital I is your unknown. You might get another problem or two. That's like number 3, where they want you to find the principal. Principal is the money you deposit, if it's a savings account problem, or it's the money you borrow, which could be called a loan, like we had here on problem number 3. And then don't forget, R is the percent in decimal form, and the time must be in years. If it's not in years, if it's in months, like number 2, then you're going to have to convert it to years. All right, so now that I summarized all of this for you, I want you to hit pause in the video, do 4, 5, 6, and 7 on your own, and then hit play once you're ready to see how you did. Okay, have you already done 4, 5, 6, and 7? If not, hit pause now. All right, here we go. Let's see how we did. I equals PRT. This problem said it didn't say fine, but it said how much interest will she earn. So we're trying to find the interest. $3,750, that's what Eloise deposits. So that's your principal. 1.65%, move the decimal point 2 places to the left. 0.0165. 9 months. That's not even a full year. I hope you didn't do 12 divided by 9, because that would be 1.3 repeating. It can't be over 1. 9 months is less than 1. 9 divided by 12 is 0.75, also known as 3/4 of a year. Multiply this together, you're going to get You got to round to the nearest cent, $556.88. If you mess this up, hit pause now and fix it. You have to be very careful with the problems that give you the time in months because it must be converted into years. Problem number 5. I equals PRT is our opening step of work. This problem, kind of like number 4, says how much interest. So we are solving for the interest. The principal is the $2,400 loan. The interest rate, 7.5%. Move the decimal point 2 places to the left, 0.075. 2.25 years. You could write that as a decimal, 2.25. We don't have to convert it. This was not months. It already was years. Multiply. $405 of interest. Problem number 6. I equals PRT. What are we asked to find? Another problem where we are trying to find the interest. That's 3 in a row, so capital I is the unknown once again. The $8,200 that you put in your savings account, that's another word for depositing into your savings account, so that is your principal. 2.25, move the decimal point 2 places to the left, 0.0225. 18 months. Now, I know some of you are able to figure that out mentally. 12 months is 1 year. So 6 more months is half more of a year. So that's 1.5 years. If you weren't able to figure that out mentally, you could just simply take 18 months and divide by 12 to get 1.5 years. Again, the reason we did this here on number 6, but not on number 5 was already in years. Number 6 gave us months. We have to make it years. Multiply. $276.75 of interest. And finally, problem number 7. I equals PRT. What were we asked to find this time? How much initial money did she deposit? Well, I got news for you, ladies and gentlemen. That's not interest. I know initial starts with an I. I know, but initial means starting money, what you had at the beginning. And it's talking about what she's going to deposit. As you can see from higher up in your guided notes, the money you deposit is the principal. Let me give you further proof that we're not solving for interest here. It told you that she earned $2,336.55 in interest. It's telling you right there that that 2,000 number is the interest. That's capital I. So if you mess this up, feel free to hit pause and fix your work and then hit play when you're ready. 1.85% is 0.0185 because we moved the decimal point 2 places left. Is our time already in years? Yes, it already is. 10 years. So using your calculator, actually, you know what? There's a little trick here. When you multiply by 10, the decimal point will move one place to the right. So that'll be 0.185. If you don't believe me, you can double check in a calculator. Principal is still principal. The 2,000 number is still on the left. Now we can do the inverse of multiplication, which is division, and that gives you a final answer of $12,630 is the principal. That's the initial amount of money that Phyllis deposited in her account. And that concludes the guided notes on the simple interest formula I equals PRT. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.